Stay down, Lieutenant. That is a direct order." Major Jenson's voice was a wet, ragged growl, bubbling through the blood frothing at his lips. He tried to grab her wrist, but his grip was failing, his fingers slipping against the sweat and grime coating her skin. The air in the trench smelled of copper, cordite, and the acrid dust of the crumbled wall behind them. "Miller is gone, Major," Elena said, her voice terrifyingly steady against the cacophony of incoming mortar fire. "The eastern flank is wide open. They are crossing the ridge." "You are a medic," Jenson gasped, his chest heaving as he fought the pain of the shrapnel in his side. "You patch the holes. You do not pull the trigger. Keep your head down, or you will get us both killed." Elena looked at him, really looked at him, for a split second. Then she looked at the MK-13 sniper rifle lying in the dirt next to Miller's motionless body. The scope was dusty, but the bolt was closed. The enemy was 300 meters out and closing. There was no air support. There was no backup. There was only the inevitable math of ballistics and time. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered. She pulled her hand away from his weak grasp. She did not reach for gauze. She reached for the rifle. "Vance, don't you dare!" She shouldered the heavy stock, exhaling a breath she felt she had been holding for years. The world narrowed down to a single crosshair. Click. 48 hours earlier, forward operating base Sierra, border region. The heat in the tent was a physical weight, pressing down with the smell of stale sweat, gun oil, and the sharp chemical tang of antiseptic. Lieutenant Elena Vance stood by the supply crates, her fingers moving deftly as she organized the contents of her IFAC, individual first aid kit. Gauze, tourniquet, morphine, chest seal. Each item had a place, and each place was memorized by touch. She didn't need to look up to know he was there. The shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable, a sudden drop in temperature despite the sweltering Afghan afternoon. "I didn't ask for a babysitter. Command sent me one anyway." The voice was gravel over concrete. Major Breaker Jenson stood at the entrance of the tent, his silhouette blocking out the harsh sunlight. He was a mountain of a man, built like he had been carved out of granite and bad intentions. He walked past Elena as if she were a piece of furniture, heading straight for the munitions table where his team was loading magazines. Elena paused, a roll of Kerlick's gauze in her hand, then continued packing. "I am not here to babysit, Major. I am here to keep your team breathing." Jenson stopped. He turned slowly, the heavy ceramic plates of his vest shifting with a dull clack. His eyes, pale blue and piercing, drilled into her. The rest of the SEAL team, Miller, the lanky sniper, Davis, the heavy gunner, and Sanchez, the point man, fell silent, pretending to be very interested in their boots. "Breathing is my job, Lieutenant," Jenson said, stepping into her personal space. He loomed over her, radiating aggression. "Keeping them alive so they can kill the bad guys is my job. Your job is to stay out of the way, carry the heavy pack, and not freeze when the bullets start flying. Can you do that, nurse?" He emphasized the word nurse like it was an insult, a dirty word that didn't belong in his war. Elena met his gaze. She didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She had grown up in a house where silence was a weapon, and she knew how to wield it. "I am a combat medic, sir. And yes, I can do my job. The question is, will you let me?" Jenson scoffed, a short, sharp sound. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I don't need a tourist with a medical degree out there. We are going into the Korangal. It's steep, it's dirty, and it's fast. If you lag behind, I will leave you behind. Is that clear? Crystal, Major. Good. Jenson straightened up, dismissing her entirely. He turned back to his men. Wheels up in 20 mics. Check your comms, check your kills. We are hunting a ghost today, boys. Let's make sure we send him to hell before dinner. The men erupted in a chorus of hoo-ah, the tension breaking into the familiar ritual of pre-combat preparation. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was controlling. She looked down at her hands. They were steady, perfectly steady. She zipped up her medical bag, the sound loud in the sudden lull. Miller, the sniper, walked by her on his way out. He paused for a second, shifting his long rifle case on his shoulder. He was younger than Jenson, with tired eyes. Don't mind him, ma'am, Miller murmured, barely moving his lips. He just doesn't want to write any letters home to your parents. He worries. It comes out as being an asshole. I don't need him to worry, Miller, Elena replied softly, slinging her pack over her shoulder. It was heavy, 50 pounds of gear that she carried without a grimace. I just need him to trust me. Miller looked at her, then at the standard-issue M4 carbine strapped across her chest, a weapon that looked clean, almost unused. He gave a half shrug. Trust is earned in ounces and lost in gallons out here. Just, keep your head down, Doc. Elena watched him leave. She touched the cold metal of her rifle receiver. It felt alien compared to the custom stock she used to hold years ago, in a life that felt like a dream. She hadn't fired a precision shot in 3 years. She had traded the trigger for the tourniquet. Just a nurse, she thought, the words echoing Jenson's disdain. She walked out into the blinding sun, her shadow stretching long and thin against the dusty earth. She had no idea that in less than 48 hours, the only thing standing between these men and slaughter would be the very skills she had sworn to leave behind. Vance, move it! Jenson roared from the idling Black Hawk. Elena broke into a jog, her face a mask of calm. She was ready. The interior of the MH-60 Black Hawk was a vibrating cage of noise and darkness. There was no talking, only the rhythmic, bone-rattling thrum of the rotors overhead and the high-pitched whine of the transmission. Elena sat squeezed between Sanchez and a stack of ammo crates, her knees pulled tight against her chest. The air smelled of burnt aviation fuel and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Through the open bay door, the world outside was a rushing void. Under the green phosphor glow of her night vision goggles, NVGs, the Afghan landscape below looked like the surface of the moon, jagged peaks, deep black crevices, and an endless ocean of unforgiving stone. They were flying nap of the earth, hugging the terrain contours to avoid radar detection, a stomach-churning roller coaster ride that tested even the strongest constitution. 2 minutes, the crew chief signaled, holding up 2 fingers. Elena checked her gloves. Nomex flight gloves, reinforced leather palms, essential for what came next. She adjusted the strap of her medical bag. It had to be tight enough not to swing, but loose enough to access instantly. Every piece of gear was a potential snagging hazard during a fast rope insertion. 1 minute! Hook up! The command crackled through her headset. Jenson was already standing by the door, a dark monolith against the rushing wind. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He expected them to be ready. The helicopter flared hard, the nose pitching up as the pilot fought the erratic downdrafts of the valley. The bird shuddered, hovering precariously over a narrow ridge that looked barely wide enough to stand on. The dust cloud kicked up by the rotor wash, the brownout, swallowed the world in a swirling storm of grit. Go, go, go! The thick braided rope kicked out the door. Jenson went first, sliding into the abyss with practiced ease. Miller followed, then Davis. It was Sanchez's turn, then Elena. Sanchez grabbed the rope, but as he swung out, a sudden gust of wind slammed the helicopter sideways. The bird dropped 10 feet in a heartbeat. Sanchez lost his footing on the skid, his body swinging wildly away from the rope's center of gravity. His boot caught in a coil of the excess line near the floor. He was going to fall, or worse, get dragged if the pilot had to pull up. Without thinking, Elena lunged forward. She didn't grab the rope. She grabbed Sanchez's vest, anchoring him with her entire body weight against the frame of the door. "Stabilize!" she yelled over the comms, though she knew only the crew could hear the internal loop. She shoved him hard, freeing his boot from the snag, and guided his hand back to a secure lock on the rope. Sanchez nodded, a jerk of the helmet, and slid down. Elena followed instantly. She wrapped her boots around the thick rope, controlling her descent. The friction burned through her gloves, a comforting heat in the freezing night. She hit the ground hard, her knees bending to absorb the impact, dust swirling violently around her. She unclipped and rolled to the perimeter, raising her rifle to scan her sector as trained. "Vance! On me!" Jenson's voice cut through the comms, sharp and angry. As the helicopter pulled away, leaving them in a sudden ringing silence, Jenson stormed over to her position. In the monochrome green of the night vision, his face was a mask of shadows, but his body language was screaming. "What the hell was that?" he hissed, leaning in close so his voice wouldn't carry down the valley. "You hesitated at the door. You clogged the fatal funnel. 5 seconds, Vance. You cost us 5 seconds on the LZ. That is 5 seconds the enemy has to target us." "Sanchez got snagged," Elena replied, her voice low and even. "The bird dipped. I cleared him. I saw you grab him. It looked like you were holding on for dear life." Jenson spat back. "If you can't handle the insertion, you stay on the bird next time. Do not touch my men unless they are bleeding. Do you understand?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back on her, raising a fist to signal the team. "Move out! Diamond formation! Miller, take point!" Elena stood there for a second, the dust settling on her shoulders. Sanchez walked past her. He paused, just for a fraction of a second, and tapped his gloved hand against his thigh. A subtle acknowledgement. He knew what happened. But it didn't matter. In Jenson's eyes, she was a liability, a hesitation, a risk. She adjusted her grip on her rifle, swallowing the bitter taste of injustice. "Focus," she told herself. "The mission comes first." She fell into formation at the rear, the position of the medic, watching the backs of the men who didn't want her there, walking into the dark throat of the valley. The valley was not silent. To the untrained ear, it might have seemed dead, a vacuum of sound where the wind died against the sheer granite walls. But to Elena, amplified by her electronic headset, the night was full of noise. The scrape of ceramic plates against nylon gear, the soft crunch of vibram soles on loose scree, the labored rhythmic breathing of men carrying 80 pounds of kit at 6,000 feet above sea level. They moved in a tactical column, spaced 10 meters apart. Miller was on point, his movements fluid and ghost-like. Jenson was second, commanding the center. Elena brought up the rear, her eyes constantly scanning the high ground that loomed over them like the walls of a cathedral built by giants. The Arghandab River Valley was notorious for a reason. It was a geographic funnel, a natural kill zone where the high ground dictated survival. The terrain was brutal. The satellite imagery had promised a relatively flat approach along a dried riverbed, but the reality was a chaotic jumble of boulders and unexpected drop-offs. Every step was a calculation. A rolled ankle here meant a medical evacuation, and a medical evacuation meant failure. Elena wiped a bead of sweat from her eyebrow, her eyes stinging. Despite the freezing temperature of the high desert night, her body was burning under the layers of armor. She kept her spacing, watching the dark silhouette of Davis ahead of her. She wasn't just walking, she was reading the ground. It was a habit from her past life, from days spent tracking game and calculating windage before she ever learned how to stitch a wound. Then she saw it. It was a minute detail, something easily missed in the wash of green static from the night vision goggles. Near the base of a jagged rock formation, about 2 meters off their path, the dirt had been disturbed, not by wind and not by an animal. Elena clicked her radio once, a signal to halt. The column froze instantly. The discipline was absolute. Jenson's voice crackled in her ear, barely a whisper. Report. Visual anomaly, 6 o'clock, request permission to inspect. Elena whispered back. There was a pause, heavy with irritation. Make it quick. Elena moved low and fast, crouching beside the rock. She swept the dust away with a gloved finger. There, half buried in the shale, was a brass casing. She picked it up, feeling the metal. It wasn't cold, it wasn't warm, but it wasn't freezing like the stones around it. It retained the faintest ghost of heat, or perhaps just the lack of deep frost. She examined the head stamp. It wasn't the standard Soviet surplus junk usually found in these mountains. It was high-grade, match ammunition. 7.6250 ORR, but clean. Precision manufactured. Jenson was suddenly beside her, his presence looming large. He didn't speak, just held out a hand. Elena placed the casing in his palm. It's fresh, Major. No oxidation. Someone was here. Recently. Within the last hour. Jenson rolled the brass between his thumb and forefinger. He looked at the casing, then at the towering cliffs above them, then back at Elena. This valley has been a war zone for 40 years, Vance. There is brass everywhere. Not this kind, Elena insisted, her voice urgent but hushed. This is match grade, sniper ammo, and the disturbance in the dirt. Someone was lying prone here, waiting, watching the LZ. Jenson closed his fist over the casing. He dropped it back into the dirt and ground it under his boot. We are on a strict timeline. Intel says the HVT is in Compound A, 2 clicks north. If there were spotters, we'd have taken fire on the insertion. Or they are drawing us in, Elena countered. Sir, if they have eyes on us, the element of surprise is gone. We should hold and... We do not hold, Jenson cut her off, his voice hard steel. We execute. You're seeing ghosts, Lieutenant. Stick to the medical bag. Let me handle the tactics. He turned away, tapping his radio. Move out. Pick up the pace. Elena stared at the crushed casing in the dirt. Her stomach twisted, a knot of cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. It wasn't fear for herself. It was the specific, professional anxiety of seeing a variable that didn't fit the equation. She knew what that casing meant. It meant a disciplined shooter. It meant preparation. But she was just the medic. She was the tourist. She stood up, checking her rifle, and fell back into formation. As they resumed their march, the valley walls seemed to lean in closer, pressing against the sky. The silence returned, but now it felt different. It felt like a held breath. They were walking deeper into the dark, and for the first time, Elena felt the distinct sensation of being watched from above. Compound A emerged from the darkness like a decaying tooth against the mountainside. It was a single-story mud brick structure, surrounded by a low, crumbling wall that offered minimal cover. The wind had died down, leaving a silence so profound it felt heavy, pressing against the eardrums. The team moved with the synchronized lethality of a single organism. Jenson signaled with a closed fist, and the stack formed up on the main breach point, a rusted iron door that looked as if it hadn't been opened in years. Miller covered the rear, his rifle scanning the high ridges that loomed invisibly above them. Elena took her position at the back of the stack, her hand resting lightly on Davis's shoulder, ready to rush in and triage any casualties the moment the room was cleared. "Breacher up," Jenson whispered over the comms. Sanchez moved forward, placing a small strip charge on the lock mechanism. He stepped back, shielding his body. A muffled thump cracked the silence, not loud enough to echo across the valley, but enough to shatter the rust. The door swung inward with a groan of metal. "Go! Go!" The SEALs flowed into the room. The beams of their IR lasers cut through the dusty air like solid bars of light. "Clear left! Clear right! Hallway clear!" The calls were sharp, professional, devoid of emotion. But as they swept through the main room and the adjoining chambers, the tension in the air shifted from anticipation to confusion. There were no guards, no sleeping insurgents, no HVT. The rooms were bare, stripped of furniture, holding only the smell of old dust and rat droppings. Elena moved to the center of the main room. On a small wooden crate in the corner, a single device blinked with a rhythmic red light. It was a military-grade radio repeater, wired to a car battery. "Major," Elena said, her voice hollow. She pointed her rifle at the device. "There is no hostage. It's a repeater. They just bounced the signal here." Jenson stormed over, ripping the wires out of the device. The blinking light died. He spun around, his chest heaving. Under the night vision, his eyes were wide, scanning the empty walls as if looking for a hidden door. "Intel was solid," he growled, more to himself than the team. "They said he was here. This is impossible." "It's not impossible," Elena said quietly. "It's a setup. The casing outside. The lack of resistance. They wanted us inside." Before Jenson could respond, the radio in his ear crackled with static. Not the secure encryption of their channel, but a jamming signal, a harsh, oscillating screech that drowned out everything. Then the world turned white. A massive explosion detonated outside the compound wall, shaking the ground so violently that dust rained down from the ceiling rafters. The shockwave slammed against the mud bricks, cracking them. "Contact! Contact rear!" Miller yelled from the doorway. Elena was thrown against the wall by the tremor. As she scrambled to her feet, a sizzling sound cut through the air, followed by a sharp pop high above. Through the blown-open door, the night sky was suddenly erased. A parachute flare ignited, hanging suspended in the air. It burned with a blinding, artificial magnesium brilliance, casting stark, dancing shadows across the valley floor. The cover of darkness, their greatest ally, was instantly stripped away. They were bathed in light, exposed and vulnerable. "Incoming!" The first volley of machine gun fire tore into the compound walls. It wasn't sporadic insurgent fire. It was coordinated, heavy, and plunging from the high ground. Bullets punched through the thin mud bricks, sending plumes of dirt exploding into the room. "Get down! Get away from the walls!" Jenson roared, diving behind a pile of rubble. Elena hit the deck, covering her head as debris showered over her. The sound was deafening, the crack thump of supersonic rounds passing inches overhead. The ambush wasn't just a skirmish, it was an execution. They were in the bottom of a bowl, and the enemy was on the rim, looking down. "We are compromised," Sanchez shouted, firing a burst blindly out the door. "They have the high ground, everywhere!" Jenson looked at Elena. For a split second, the arrogance was gone, replaced by the stark realization of their predicament. They were trapped in a kill box, exactly as she had feared. "Defensive positions!" Jenson ordered, his voice fighting to be heard over the roar of the ambush. "We hold this house. Nobody goes out." The world inside the mud brick compound had dissolved into a chaotic storm of dust and noise. The enemy fire was relentless, a torrential downpour of lead that chewed through the dried earth walls as if they were made of paper. Chunks of clay and straw exploded inward, filling the air with a choking, blinding powder. "Get off the net! Clear the channel!" Jenson screamed into his handset, his voice straining against the deafening roar of a PKM machine gun hammering the south wall. He was crouched behind a pile of debris, pressing the radio mic to his lips. "Havoc Base, this is Sierra 1. We are taking effective fire from multiple elevated positions. We need KS immediately. Danger close." Elena was prone next to Sanchez, her body curled tight to present the smallest possible target. She wasn't firing. Her job right now wasn't to shoot. It was to ensure that if anyone was hit, she was ready. She watched the walls disintegrate, bullet holes appearing like magic, letting in shafts of harsh magnesium light from the flares outside. Jenson slammed his fist against the dirt floor. "Say again, Havoc? Denied? What do you mean denied?" He looked up, his face streaked with dust and fury. "They can't get an angle. The canyon walls are too steep. We are on our own." The realization hit the team like a physical blow. No air support. No gunship raining death from above. Just 5 rifles against an entrenched enemy force that held all the cards. "Major, this structure is compromised," Miller shouted from his position near a window slit. He flinched as a bullet sparked off the frame inches from his face. "We can't hold this. The walls are too thin. They're going to shred us." "There's a ruin," Sanchez called out, pointing towards the east. 50 meters, stone walls. It looks like an old watchtower foundation. 50 meters across open ground, Jenson countered, scanning the killing field outside. "Might as well be 50 miles. "If we stay, we die," Elena said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the panic. She looked at Jenson. "The mortars are next, sir. Once they dial in the range, this roof will collapse on us." As if to punctuate her point, a dull thump echoed in the distance, followed seconds later by an explosion that shook the ground just outside the courtyard. They were walking the mortars in. Jenson gritted his teeth. He knew she was right. "Miller, can you suppress that machine gun on the ridge? We need a window." Miller didn't answer verbally. He shifted his position, sliding the barrel of his MK-13 sniper rifle through a jagged hole in the wall. He took a breath, holding it. In the chaos of combat, his stillness was unnatural. Crack. The sound of the sniper rifle was distinct, a sharp, authoritative whip crack that differed from the rattle of automatic fire. On the ridge 300 meters away, the relentless hammering of the PKM stopped abruptly. "Gunner down!" Miller yelled, cycling the bolt. "Move! Go! Go!" "Sanchez, Davis, provide cover! Vance, on me! Move!" Jenson ordered. They broke cover. Running across the open ground felt like running through water. Elena pumped her legs, the weight of her medical pack slamming against her spine with every stride. The air around her snapped and hissed. Snap, hiss. snap, hiss. Those were the rounds passing close enough to break the sound barrier near her ears. She didn't look left or right. She focused solely on the dark shape of the stone ruins ahead. She could hear Sanchez and Davis firing behind her, short, controlled bursts to keep the enemy heads down. She dove over a low stone wall, landing hard on her shoulder, skidding across the gravel. Jenson landed beside her a second later, followed by the rest of the team. They were panting, lungs burning from the sprint and the altitude. This new position was better. Thick, ancient stones that had withstood centuries of conflict. They were in a dead angle, a small pocket of cover that the enemy on the high ridges couldn't easily fire into directly. "Sound off," Jenson barked, checking his weapon. "Miller, good. Sanchez, good. Davis, good. Vance?" Jenson looked at her. Elena quickly ran her hands over her limbs, checking for blood she might not have felt due to the adrenaline. "Clear. No hits." They were alive. But as Elena looked up at the rim of the canyon, she saw the flashlight beams of the enemy moving, encircling their position. The silence from the ridge wasn't a retreat. It was a repositioning. The noose was tightening. They had traded a paper house for a stone tomb. The stone ruins offered better ballistic protection than the mud hut, but they were also a cage. The team was pinned in a depression of ancient granite, surrounded by crumbling walls that barely reached chest height. Above them, the dark rim of the canyon was a theater of muzzle flashes. The enemy wasn't rushing down. They were content to sit on the high ground and pick the seals apart piece by piece. "We are blind down here," Jenson growled, changing the magazine on his rifle. His face was a mask of grime and frustration. "If we can't see them, we can't kill them. Miller, I need eyes on that ridge." Miller looked up at a jagged section of the wall that jutted out like a broken tooth. It was the highest point of the ruin, offering a precarious line of sight towards the enemy's main firing position. "I can get up there," Miller said, his voice calm, detached. He patted the stock of his MK-13 sniper rifle. "I can suppress the machine gun, maybe spot the spotters for the mortars." Elena watched him from her position near the wounded. "It is exposed, Miller. If they have thermal—" "They don't have thermal," Miller cut in, offering her a brief, tight smile. "They are just shooting at shadows. I'll make it quick. Pop up, take the shot, drop down." Jenson nodded, a sharp, decisive movement. "Do it. Davis, give him suppressive fire on my mark. Keep their heads down while he sets up." Miller moved with the grace of a cat, climbing the pile of rubble silently. He didn't rush. Sniper craft was about patience and slow, deliberate movement. He reached the ledge and began to ease the barrel of his long rifle through a crevice in the stones. He didn't expose his head yet. He was clearing the space for his scope. "Ready?" Miller whispered over the comms. "Light 'em up!" Jenson roared. Davis and Sanchez unleashed a torrent of fire towards the ridge. The canyon echoed with the thunder of the heavy machine gun. For a moment, the enemy fire slackened as they ducked for cover. Miller took the opportunity. He slid into position, settling the stock against his shoulder, his eye finding the scope. He was the hunter looking for his prey. But there was another hunter on the mountain, one who had been waiting for exactly this moment. One who wasn't suppressed by the machine gun fire because he was positioned far to the left, separated from the main group. There was no warning, no muzzle flash that Miller could have seen in time. Just a wet, meaty impact that sounded sickeningly loud in the enclosed space. Miller didn't fire. His head snapped back violently, a mist of red spraying against the gray stone wall behind him. He crumpled instantly, sliding down the rubble pile like a discarded doll, his rifle clattering against the rocks. "Man down! Man down!" Elena screamed, scrambling forward before the order was even given. She reached him before he hit the bottom of the slope. He was on his back, eyes wide open, staring up at the indifferent stars. His hands were clawing at his throat. "Pressure! I need pressure!" Elena yelled, her training taking over. She ripped open her medical kit, her hands slick with blood within seconds. But even as she pressed the gauze into the wound, she knew. The bullet had entered just below the jawline and exited the back of the neck. The carotid artery was severed. The blood wasn't flowing. It was pumping, jetting out with the rhythm of his failing heart. "Stay with me, Miller. Look at me," Elena commanded, her voice cracking. Miller tried to speak, but only a gurgling, wet sound came out. Bubbles of blood formed at his lips. His grip on her wrist, initially iron-hard, began to loosen. The panic in his eyes faded into a dull, glassy stare. Jenson was there a second later, dragging them both down behind the cover of the main wall as bullets began to chip away at the stones where Miller had just been. "Fix him, Vance!" Jenson barked, his eyes wild. "Get him back in the fight!" Elena looked up at the major. Her face was speckled with Miller's blood. She shook her head slowly. The flow had stopped, not because she had stopped it, but because the heart had nothing left to pump. "He's gone, sir," she whispered. Jenson stared at the body of his sniper. He looked at the MK-13 rifle lying in the dirt, the scope covered in dust. A heavy silence fell over the team, heavier than the gunfire outside. They had lost their eyes. They had lost their reach. "Damn it!" Jenson punched the stone wall, a futile gesture of rage. He looked at Elena, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of doubt behind the anger. The invincible shield of the SEAL team had been pierced. Elena closed Miller's eyes. She wiped her hands on her pants, leaving dark streaks. She didn't have time to mourn. She checked her gear. The night was far from over, and the odds had just tipped drastically against them. The death of a team member usually brings a moment of stunned silence, a vacuum where the brain tries to process the impossible. But in the Arghandab Valley, there was no silence. There was only the escalating fury of the enemy fire. Miller's body lay in the shadow of the stone wall, a grim testament to the precision of the sniper on the ridge. Major Jenson looked at the corpse, and something inside him snapped. It wasn't fear, it was a cold, volatile rage. He was the team leader. He was responsible for bringing these men home, and he had just failed. "Davis, keep that gun talking," Jenson roared, his voice raw. "Don't let them set up again." He grabbed 2 M18 smoke grenades from his vest. His plan was desperate but necessary. Create a wall of smoke to blind the sniper, allowing them to retrieve Miller's ammunition and perhaps shift position before the mortars dialed in their final coordinates. "Cover me!" Jenson shouted. "Major, wait!" Elena called out from her position, her hand halfway raised. "It's too hot." Jenson ignored her. He pulled the pin on the first grenade and hurled it over the wall. He stood up, exposing his upper body to throw the second one further down the slope. It was a calculated risk, a moment of exposure for a lifetime of cover. But the enemy was waiting. They weren't just watching with rifles, they had brought up the heavy hitters. A distinctive whoosh cut through the noise of the gunfire, a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of canvas. "RPG!" Sanchez screamed. Jenson tried to dive back, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. The rocket didn't hit him directly. If it had, there would have been nothing left to bury. Instead, it struck the outer face of the stone wall, 3 feet from where he stood. The explosion was a concussive hammer blow that sucked the air out of the ruins. A cloud of pulverized rock, black smoke, and fire erupted inward. Jenson was lifted off his feet and thrown backward like a rag doll, slamming hard against the opposite wall of the enclosure. For a moment, Elena couldn't hear anything. The blast had overpressured her ears, leaving only a high-pitched, screaming tinnitus. The world was slow motion. Dust hung in the air like thick fog. She saw Jenson lying in the dirt, writhing. "Major!" Her hearing rushed back in a painful wave of noise. Jenson was groaning, a guttural sound of agony. He was in the open, exposed to the angle where the wall had been blown away. "Covering fire, now!" Elena screamed at Davis and Sanchez, her voice surprisingly commanding. She didn't think about the sniper. She didn't think about the stay put order. She scrambled across the debris on her hands and knees, keeping low. Bullets kicked up dirt around her, angry hornet stings in the ground. She reached Jenson. He was conscious but dazed. The right side of his uniform was shredded. Blood was already dark and pooling on the gray dust. Shrapnel had torn into his thigh and the side of his torso, bypassing the ceramic plate. "Get up, sir! We have to move!" she yelled, grabbing the drag handle on the back of his vest. Jenson tried to push himself up, but his leg collapsed under him. He grunted, his face contorted. "Leave me! Get back! Shut up, Major!" Elena grunted, digging her boots into the loose gravel. She hauled him backward with all her strength. He was heavy, over 200 pounds of muscle and gear, dead weight in the dirt. She dragged him inch by painful inch back into the defilade, behind the thickest part of the remaining wall. She collapsed next to him, her chest heaving, her lungs burning with dust and exertion. Jenson lay on his back, staring up at her. His eyes were unfocused, shock beginning to set in. His hand fumbled for his weapon, but his grip was weak. "Miller," he rasped. "Miller is gone," Elena said, her voice shaking but her hands steady as she ripped the trauma shears from her vest. "And if you don't hold still, you're going to join him." She looked down at the wound. It was bad, arterial bad. The hierarchy of the team had just been decapitated by a high-explosive warhead. The major was down, the sniper was dead, and the enemy was closing in. The alcove behind the stone wall became a butcher's shop within seconds. The air was thick with the copper scent of fresh blood, overpowering the cordite and dust. Jenson was thrashing, his survival instinct fighting against the shock, his boots scraping uselessly against the gravel as he tried to push himself upright. "Stay down," Elena shouted, her voice dropping an octave into the command tone she used for trauma patients. She straddled his good leg, using her body weight to pin him to the dirt. "Sanchez, Davis, watch the perimeter. Do not let them cross that open ground." She ripped the trauma shears from her molly webbing and sliced through the fabric of Jenson's tactical pants. The heavy nylon tore with a rasping sound, revealing the damage. It was catastrophic. A jagged piece of shrapnel the size of a finger had torn into his upper right thigh, dangerously close to the inguinal crease. The femoral artery hadn't been severed completely. If it had, he would already be dead. But the blood was dark red and flowing fast. "Vance, get off!" Jenson gritted out, his teeth clenched so hard his jaw muscles bulged. "Get my radio. I need to call." "You are bleeding out, Major." "Shut up and let me work!" Elena snapped. She didn't have time for rank. She grabbed a combat application tourniquet, CAT, from her kit. She slid it high up his leg, jamming it right into the groin, as high as it would go. She twisted the windlass rod. 1 turn, 2 turns. The strap bit into Jenson's muscle like a vice. Jenson roared, a sound of pure, white-hot agony that cut through the noise of the firefight. His hand shot out and grabbed Elena's collar, yanking her down. "Stop!" he gasped, sweat popping out on his forehead instantly. "I have to stop the bleed!" Elena yelled back, ignoring his grip. She twisted the rod 1 more time and locked it in the clip. The flow of blood slowed to a trickle. She immediately grabbed a pack of combat gauze, impregnated with a clotting agent. This was the part that broke even the toughest men. She had to pack the wound. "This is going to hurt," she warned. She didn't wait for permission. She shoved the gauze deep into the laceration, packing it tight against the bone to create internal pressure. Jenson's back arched off the ground. He let go of her collar and slammed his head back against the dirt, a string of curses escaping his lips. His face went pale, gray under the grime. Elena reached for the auto-injector of morphine in her medkit. "No!" Jenson wheezed, his eyes snapping open. He slapped her hand away, knocking the injector into the dirt. "No dope, no drugs. Major, you are going into shock. The pain will knock you out." "If you drug me, I can't think," Jenson panted, his chest heaving. "I need to command. If I go under, we all die. That is an order, Lieutenant." Elena looked at him. His pupils were dilated, his skin clammy. He was right on the edge. But she saw the ferocity in his eyes. He was terrified, not of dying, but of losing control of his team. She put the morphine away. "Fine, but you stay still. If you pop that tourniquet, I can't save you again." "Situation!" Jenson yelled, his voice weaker now, lacking the gravelly boom it usually held. "They're moving!" Sanchez shouted from the corner of the ruin. "They know Miller is down. They know we're hurt. I see movement in the wadi, 3 o'clock. About 20 packs, forming up for a rush." Jenson tried to reach for his rifle, but his arm trembled uncontrollably. He couldn't lift it. The realization washed over him, visible even in the dim light. He was combat ineffective. The alpha wolf had been hamstrung. He looked at Elena. For the first time, he didn't look at her with disdain. He looked at her with desperation. I can't hold a sight picture." "I know," Elena whispered, wiping her bloody hands on her pants. She checked his pulse, thready and fast. "Sanchez is suppressed," Jenson said, the tactical reality settling in. "Davis is reloading. We have no long gun. If they rush us, they will be here in less than 2 minutes." Elena finished the sentence. The enemy fire intensified, shifting from suppressive bursts to a steady rhythm of cover fire. They were preparing to move. The crescendo of battle was building towards a final, violent clash. Elena looked at her medical bag, then at the empty space where Miller used to be. The role of the healer was over. The time for triage had passed. The tactical situation was deteriorating with the speed of a landslide. What had started as a suppression strategy by the enemy had shifted into an aggressive assault maneuver. Through the gaps in the stone wall, Elena could see them. Shadows detaching themselves from the darkness of the wadi, bounding forward in short rushes, using the terrain to close the distance. "They are flanking right! East side!" Davis screamed, his voice cracking. He unleashed a long burst from his machine gun, but the barrel was glowing cherry red, and his ammunition belt was running dangerously low. "I can't reach them. They're outside my effective range." The enemy had identified the weakness. They knew the SEAL sniper was dead. They were staying exactly 300 meters out, close enough to suppress the Americans with volume of fire, but far enough that the SEAL's carbines were inaccurate without optic magnification. They were setting up a classic L-shaped ambush to finish the job. Jenson tried to sit up, coughing blood onto his shredded uniform. Davis, conserve ammo, single shots. It was a futile order. Single shots from a carbine at that distance, under stress, against moving targets in the dark, were wasted prayers. Elena looked at Jenson, then at the eastern ridge. The math was simple. In 3 minutes, the enemy would be in grenade range. In 4 minutes, they would be dead. She looked to her left. Miller's body lay still in the dust, covered by a poncho liner she had hastily thrown over him. But sticking out from under the fabric was the barrel of the Mk13 Mod 5, the sniper rifle. It was a heavy, ugly, beautiful machine. A tool designed for one purpose: surgical removal of threats at distance. Elena felt a strange sensation wash over her. The panic that had fluttered in her chest during the explosion evaporated. The frantic energy of the trauma assessment vanished. In its place came a cold, crystalline clarity. It was a feeling she hadn't felt in years, not since the national championships, not since she locked her rifle away to pick up a stethoscope. She wiped the blood from her hands onto her pants. She didn't reach for another bandage. She reached for the rifle. "Stay down, Lieutenant. That is a direct order." Jenson's voice was a wet, ragged growl, bubbling through the blood frothing at his lips. He saw what she was doing. He tried to grab her wrist, but his grip was failing, his fingers slipping against the sweat and grime coating her skin. "Miller is gone, Major," Elena said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, terrifyingly steady against the cacophony of incoming mortar fire. "The eastern flank is wide open. They are crossing the ridge." "You are a medic," Jenson gasped, his chest heaving as he fought the pain of the shrapnel in his side. His eyes were wide, fueled by a mixture of shock and professional outrage. "You patch the holes. You do not pull the trigger. Keep your head down, or you will get us both killed." Elena looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the fear behind the command. He wasn't afraid of her dying. He was afraid of the order of things breaking down. If the medic started fighting, the battle was already lost in his mind. "I am sorry, sir," she whispered. She pulled her hand away from his weak grasp. She crawled over to Miller's body. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the heavy rifle from beneath the poncho. It was heavier than the sporting rifles of her youth, weighted with accessories and the grim reality of war. But the balance was perfect. "Vance, don't you dare!" She ignored him. She ignored Sanchez shouting for ammo. She ignored the bullets chipping the stone inches above her head. She propped the rifle on the crumbling wall, digging the bipod legs into the grit. She pressed her cheek against the stock. It was cold, a familiar, deadly cold. She opened both eyes. She found the scope's exit pupil. The world narrowed down. The chaotic, noisy battlefield disappeared, replaced by the silent, magnified reticle of the Night Force scope. There he was, 320 meters, an enemy squad leader, waving his men forward, confident in his safety. Elena exhaled, a long, slow breath that emptied her lungs. She felt her heart rate drop, thump, thump, thump. She wasn't a nurse. She wasn't a lieutenant. She was a biological platform for the weapon. Her finger found the trigger. The pad of her index finger rested on the curve of the metal. No jerking, no hesitation, just a steady increase of pressure until the break. Click. The rifle recoiled into her shoulder, a solid, heavy kick. The recoil of the .300 Winchester Magnum was a solid, punishing shove against her shoulder, heavier than the 550mm carbines she carried daily, but familiar in a way that made her bones ache with memory. Downrange, through the magnified optics, the result was instantaneous. The enemy squad leader who had been waving his men forward simply ceased to exist as a threat. He dropped straight down, a puppet with its strings cut. Elena didn't blink. She didn't celebrate. In the world of precision shooting, the shot you just took didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was the next one. She racked the bolt back. The empty brass casing spun out, chiming against the stones like a bell. She pushed the bolt forward, stripping a fresh round from the magazine and locking it into the chamber. The mechanical clack-clack was smooth, oiled, perfect. "Vance," Jenson whispered, his voice barely audible over the ringing in his ears. He was staring at her, his hand frozen halfway to his radio. He looked like he was seeing a stranger wearing his medic's face. "Wind is full value, left to right, 5 miles per hour," Elena murmured, her voice flat, devoid of the tremor that had been there minutes ago. She wasn't talking to him. She was talking to the rifle. "Range 350, hold 1 mil right." She shifted the crosshairs. The threat wasn't the infantry anymore. It was the PKM machine gun on the ridge. The gunner had paused, confused by the sudden drop of his commander, but he was swinging the heavy barrel towards the ruins. If he opened up now, with their position fixed, he would turn the stone alcove into a gravel pit. Elena adjusted her body position. Miller was taller than her. His length of pull was different. She had to crawl forward on the stock, forcing her cheek weld to be inconsistent. It wasn't perfect, but it had to work. She focused on her breathing. Inhale, exhale, pause, the respiratory pause, that empty space between breaths where the body is perfectly still. The chaos of the battlefield, the screaming of Sanchez for ammo, the thumping of the mortars walking closer, it all faded into background static. The reticle settled on the machine gunner's chest. He was prone, a difficult target, mostly obscured by rocks. Only his head and upper torso were visible. "Don't miss," she told herself. "If you miss, he sees the flash. He kills us all." She applied pressure to the trigger. The trigger on a sniper rifle is a glass rod. You don't pull it, you break it. Crack, the rifle jumped. Elena rode the recoil, keeping her eye glued to the scope to spot the impact. A pink mist erupted from behind the rock. The PKM barrel jerked upward, firing a burst into the sky before falling silent. "Target down," Elena stated. "Gunner neutralized." "Holy..." Davis's voice came over the team net, breathless. "Who took that shot? Miller? I thought Miller was gone." "Miller is gone," Jenson replied, his eyes never leaving Elena. He watched her cycle the bolt again, her movements efficient, robotic. There was no hesitation, no shaking hands. The medic who had trembled while packing his wound was gone. In her place was something colder, something dangerous. "Vance is on the gun." "Vance?" Sanchez echoed, disbelief heavy in his tone. "Clear the net," Elena cut in. Her tone was no longer that of a subordinate. It was the tone of the person holding the biggest stick. "I have 3 movers in the open, adjusting fire." She didn't wait for confirmation. She swung the barrel slightly to the right. The remaining enemy soldiers were scrambling, confused. They had assumed the American sniper was dead. The sudden, precise violence from the ruins had shattered their confidence. they hesitated, looking for cover that wasn't there. Elena found her next target, a radio operator trying to crawl behind a boulder. She breathed out. The world was just math. Distance, wind, time, crack. The operator slumped forward. The radio on his back sparked as a second round. A follow-up shot she sent 2 seconds later destroyed the equipment. Elena felt a strange, terrifying calm settle over her. It was the zone, the mental state her father had trained her to enter before a competition. But this wasn't paper targets. These were men. And she wasn't scoring points. She was buying time. Every pull of the trigger bought Jenson another breath. Every empty casing was a few more seconds of life for the team. She worked the bolt again. The barrel was getting warm. The smell of burning propellant was sharp in her nose, mixing with the metallic scent of the blood drying on her uniform. She didn't feel like a healer anymore. She felt like the angel of death, and to her horror, she realized she was good at it. The element of surprise is a wasting asset. Elena knew this. She had bought them perhaps 30 seconds of confusion with her initial volley, but the enemy was disciplined. They realized quickly that the fire was coming from a single point in the ruins, and they adjusted with lethal efficiency. Bullets began to impact the stone wall with terrified ferocity. Chips of granite and lead spalled off the face of the rock, stinging Elena's cheek like angry hornets. She didn't flinch. She simply retracted the rifle, rolled onto her back, and crab-walked 3 meters to the left, dragging the heavy weapon across her chest. "Move! Everyone keep your heads down!" she yelled, her voice unrecognizable even to herself. She popped up at a new gap in the wall, a jagged tear in the masonry created by the RPG blast. She rested the barrel on a piece of debris, wrapping the sling around her arm for stability. Through the scope, the scene was chaotic. The enemy soldiers were no longer walking upright. They were darting between cover, suppressing the ruins with short, angry bursts. But without their machine gunner, their volume of fire had dropped significantly. Elena scanned the ridgeline. She was looking for the antenna, the radio, the voice that was directing the mortars. "Come on," she whispered, her eye straining against the optic. "Show yourself." A figure moved near a cluster of boulders, the long whip antenna on his back swaying against the night sky. He was shouting into a handset, gesturing frantically towards the SEAL's position. "Elevation, 2 mils up, wind holds," she muttered. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The recoil was a physical punishment she welcomed. It was the only thing that felt real. Downrange, the radio operator spun around as the 300 Win Mag round slammed into the equipment on his back. The radio shattered. The man collapsed, the coordination of the attack dying with him. "Comms are down," Elena announced, cycling the bolt. "They are blind." The effect was immediate. Without the central direction, the enemy fire became ragged and individual. They stopped maneuvering and started hunkering down. The mortars, which had been walking dangerously close, suddenly ceased firing as the spotter went silent. Elena felt a wave of nausea hit her. A sudden bile-tasting reminder of who she was. She was a healer. She had sworn an oath to preserve life. And yet, she felt a dark, cold satisfaction in watching the threat recede. Every man she dropped was a guarantee that Jenson, Sanchez, and Davis would see another sunrise. The contradiction tore at her gut, but her hands remained steady. "They're breaking!" Sanchez yelled, his voice thick with renewed hope. He popped up over the wall, his carbine barking in controlled pairs. "Get some! Get some!" Davis joined in, his machine gun chugging through the last of his belt. The sudden resurgence of fire from the SEAL team caught the enemy off guard. Thinking they were facing a reinforced unit rather than 3 battered men and a medic, the insurgents began to pull back, dragging their wounded into the deeper shadows of the wadi. Jenson pushed himself up to a sitting position, his back against the stone. He was pale, his face a mask of sweat and blood, but his eyes were locked on Elena. He watched her work the bolt, watched her scan for targets, watched the way she merged with the weapon as if she had been born holding it. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. The tourist he had mocked was currently the deadliest thing in the valley. The hierarchy he understood, warriors and support, sheepdogs and sheep, had been dismantled right in front of him. Elena fired one last shot at a fleeing silhouette, then lowered the rifle. The barrel was smoking hot. Her shoulder throbbed. She slumped back against the cold stone, the adrenaline crash hitting her like a physical blow. Her hands, so steady on the trigger, began to tremble as she reached for her water bottle. "Clear," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Sector clear." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the ragged breathing of the survivors and the distant echoes of the retreat. They had held. Against all odds, they had held. The silence that followed the firefight was fragile, held together only by the ringing in their ears and the distant, fading echoes of the enemy retreat. The valley floor was still, but it was a deceptive stillness. The enemy wasn't gone. They were regrouping, licking their wounds, and preparing for a final, overwhelming push to wipe out the small pocket of resistance in the ruins. Elena slung the heavy sniper rifle over her shoulder and crawled back to Jenson. The major was fading. His skin was the color of old parchment, gray and translucent under the layer of grime. The tourniquet had stopped the bleeding, but the initial blood loss had been severe. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Radio," Jenson whispered, his hand fumbling weakly at his chest rig. "Need air." Elena grabbed the handset of the PRC 148 radio clipped to his vest. She looked at him, waiting for him to take it, to do what officers did. But his hand just fell back to the dirt, his fingers twitching uselessly. He didn't have the strength to depress the push-to-talk button, let alone articulate the complex coordinates needed for a danger-close mission. She looked at Sanchez and Davis. They were watching the perimeter, their backs to her, reloading magazines with shaking hands. They were soldiers, not coordinators. The burden fell on her. Elena took a deep breath, pressing the handset to her ear. She keyed the mic. "Havoc Base, this is Sierra 1. Radio check, over." Static hissed in her ear, then a voice cut through, clear, calm, and impossibly far away. "Sierra 1, this is Havoc Base. Read you 5 by 5. Identify yourself. Where is Breaker?" The voice on the other end was expecting the deep baritone of Major Jenson, not the alto of a female medic. There was a pause, a beat of hesitation that could cost them everything. "Major Jenson is casualty status red," Elena said, her voice steady, stripping away all emotion to leave only the raw data. "This is Lieutenant Vance. I am assuming communications. We have 1 KIA, 1 urgent surgical, 2 walking wounded. We are combat ineffective, requesting immediate medevac and close air support." "Copy, Vance," the controller at Havoc Base replied, the skepticism replaced by professional urgency. "We have assets on station in 10 mics. I need a 9-line and a sit rep on enemy positions." Elena pulled the map from Jenson's pocket. She unfolded it on the dirt, illuminating it with a small red light. The contour lines swam before her eyes for a second, before snapping into focus. She had to be precise. A mistake of one grid square meant dropping a bomb on themselves. Line 1, she began, reading the coordinates of the landing zone. Grid reference, Tango Zulu 449er. She felt a hand on her arm. She looked down. Jenson had opened his eyes. He was watching her, listening to the numbers she was reciting. In any other situation, he would have snatched the radio away. He would have told her she wasn't qualified, that she didn't know the protocol, that she was just a tourist. But now, his gaze was different. The hardness was gone, replaced by a weary, profound recognition. He nodded, a slow, barely perceptible movement of his chin. It was more than permission. It was a transfer of command. He was trusting her not just with his life, but with the lives of his men and the honor of his team. Elena squeezed his hand briefly, a promise, and turned back to the radio. She continued reading the 9-line, her voice gaining strength. Line 3, 1 patient urgent surgical, 1 priority. Line 6, enemy in the open 300 meters east and north. Request danger close fire mission. Copy all, Sierra 1, Havoc Base replied. Good copy. We have an AC-130 Spectre inbound. Call sign Grim 3-1. Time on target 5 mics. Keep your heads down, Lieutenant. Help is coming. Solid copy. Havoc. Sierra 1 out. Elena lowered the handset. She felt a weight lift off her chest, only to be replaced by a new one. 5 minutes. In combat, 5 minutes was an eternity. Did you get them? Jenson whispered, his voice barely a rasp. They are coming, sir, Elena said, moving to check his dressing. The Spectre is coming. You just have to hold on. Jenson closed his eyes, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. Good work, Doc. It was the first time he had called her that without a sneer. Elena felt a lump in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She checked her watch. 4 minutes and 45 seconds left. She picked up the sniper rifle again and turned to face the dark valley. The enemy knew the timeline just as well as the SEALs did. They knew that once the radio silence was broken and the coordinates were sent, death would be arriving on wings of steel. Their hesitation vanished, replaced by a desperate, fanatical need to finish the job before the sky fell on them. They're coming out of the wadi, Sanchez screamed, his voice raw. Human wave! Front! It wasn't a tactical maneuver anymore. It was a flood. Dozens of shadows detached from the darkness, sprinting across the open ground, screaming war cries, firing from the hip. They were abandoning cover, trading lives for distance, rushing the ruins in a chaotic, terrifying surge. Hold the line, Jenson rasped, trying to lift his own pistol, but his hand shook too violently to aim. Elena slammed the bolt of the Mk-13 forward. She fired. A runner dropped. She cycled the bolt again. Fired. Another dropped. She was firing as fast as the mechanics of the rifle allowed, but there were too many of them. The distance was closing. 200 meters, 150, 100. Davis's machine gun chattered, cutting swathes through the advancing line, but the barrel was glowing white-hot and the belt was visibly shortening. Click. The sound was small, but it hit Elena like a sledgehammer. She cycled the bolt again. Nothing. The chamber was empty. The magazine was dry. She had fired every single match-grade round Miller had carried. The enemy was 50 meters out. She could see their faces now, contorted in rage, illuminated by the muzzle flashes. Elena dropped the sniper rifle. It clattered uselessly against the stones. She didn't freeze. She reached to her thigh holster and drew her sidearm, a standard-issue Sig Sauer P226. It felt toy-like compared to the rifle, a last resort for a desperate moment. She stepped in front of Jenson. She stood over him, legs braced, pistol extended in a two-handed grip. She was the final wall. "Vance, get down!" Jenson groaned, trying to pull her leg. "Don't stand." "I am not letting them touch you," Elena said, her voice low and fierce. She fired. The 9mm rounds didn't have the stopping power of a rifle, but at this range, accuracy was everything. She double-tapped a figure climbing over the outer wall. He fell back. She shifted targets. Pop, pop. Another one stumbled, but they were too close. A grenade landed just outside their wall, the explosion spraying grit over them. Sanchez was out of ammo, swinging his empty rifle like a club. Davis was down to his pistol. This is it, Elena thought. She had 3 rounds left in the magazine. Then the sky tore open. It started with a low, vibrating hum that resonated in the chest cavity, deeper than thunder. Then came the sound, a terrifying, continuous burst of the 25mm Gatling gun, followed by the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the 40mm Bofors cannon. "Grim 3-1 is on station, cleared hot." The radio crackled with the voice of God. A line of explosions erupted 50 meters in front of the ruins, a curtain of fire and shrapnel that walked horizontally across the enemy formation. The human wave didn't just break, it evaporated. Bodies were tossed into the air like dry leaves in a hurricane. Then came the 105mm howitzer, a single earth-shattering boom. The ground beneath Elena's feet jumped. The wadi where the enemy reserves were hiding erupted in a massive plume of fire and rock. "Danger close! Get down!" Elena yelled, throwing herself over Jenson to shield him from the falling debris. The noise was apocalyptic. The AC-130 gunship circled overhead, a dark angel raining precision destruction. For 30 seconds, the valley was hell on earth. And then, as quickly as it had started, the heavy guns went silent. The dust began to settle. There was no more screaming, no more gunfire. Just the drone of the aircraft engines circling lazily above, watching over them. Elena lifted her head. Her ears were ringing, her face covered in gray dust. She looked at Jenson. He was staring up at the sky, tears of relief cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "Sierra 1, this is Grim." The pilot's voice came over the radio, calm and professional. "Targets neutralized. LZ is cold. QRF is 2 mics out. Recommend you pop smoke." Elena holstered her pistol. Her hands were finally shaking. She reached into her pouch and pulled out a green smoke grenade. She pulled the pin and tossed it over the wall. The green smoke billowed out, a signal of life in the valley of death. They had made it. The silence that the AC-130 had imposed on the valley was broken by a new, rhythmic thumping that vibrated in the chest cavity. From the south, 2 MH-47 Chinooks materialized out of the darkness, their tandem rotors churning the night air into a frenzy. They came in low and aggressive, guided by the green smoke that Elena had popped, looking like prehistoric beasts seeking prey. "PJs are inbound! Get ready to move!" Elena shouted, though her voice was barely a croak. The lead Chinook flared hard, its back ramp lowering before the wheels even touched the rocky ground. The rotor wash kicked up a blinding storm of dust, reducing visibility to 0. Through the brownout, figures emerged. Men in bulky gear, moving with fresh energy. These were the pararescue jumpers, PJs, the elite combat medics of the Air Force. Elena shielded Jenson's face from the flying grit. "They are here, Major. You are going home." 2 PJs reached them, dropping a collapsible litter next to Jenson. They didn't ask questions. They saw the tourniquet, the pale skin, the blood-soaked uniform. They moved with efficient violence, lifting the heavy seal onto the canvas stretcher. Jenson groaned, his hand flailing blindly until it found Elena's arm. He gripped it hard. "Miller, don't leave Miller." "We never leave our own," Elena shouted into his ear, her face inches from his. "I have him." She watched them carry Jenson toward the gaping maw of the helicopter. Then she turned back to the darkness of the ruins. Sanchez and Davis were already there, lifting Miller's body. The sniper looked small in death, his limbs loose, the deadly weight of him now just a burden to be carried. "Let's go! Move! Move!" The crew chief screamed from the ramp, waving his arms frantically. Elena grabbed the back of Miller's vest to help distribute the weight. They stumbled across the uneven ground, fighting the wind that tried to push them back. Every step was a battle against exhaustion. Her legs felt like lead, her lungs burned, but she refused to let go. They reached the ramp. The PJs grabbed Miller's body and pulled him inside. Sanchez and Davis collapsed onto the metal floor, gasping for air. The crew chief grabbed Elena's shoulder, trying to pull her in. "Get on! We are taking fire!" Elena shrugged him off. She stopped at the edge of the ramp, her boots planted firmly on the metal grating. She turned back one last time to face the valley. She scanned the perimeter, her eyes sweeping the darkness through the green glow of her NVGs. She had to be sure. She had to be the last one. It was a superstition, perhaps, or a penance for the life she had just taken. "Clear! Everyone is inside!" she yelled into her headset. Only then did she step back into the belly of the beast. The ramp hissed hydraulically as it began to close, sealing them off from the nightmare outside. The interior of the Chinook was red-lit and noisy. The smell of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel was overwhelming. Elena didn't sit in the canvas seats. She slid down to the floor next to Jenson's litter. The PJs were already working on him, hanging an IV bag from the ceiling, checking his vitals. Jenson's eyes were open, searching. When he saw Elena, he stopped thrashing. She reached out and took his hand. It was a breach of protocol, a breach of the professional distance she had maintained so carefully. But in that moment, rank didn't exist. There was only the shared trauma of survival. Jenson squeezed her hand. His grip was weak, but the intention was ironclad. He didn't speak. He couldn't over the noise of the engines, but he didn't have to. The look in his eyes said everything. It was an apology. It was gratitude. It was respect. Elena leaned her head back against the vibrating wall of the fuselage. She looked at her hands. They were stained with Jenson's blood, with the dust of the Arghandab, and with the invisible residue of the trigger she had pulled. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 48 hours, she let herself breathe. They were safe. But she knew, with a heavy certainty, that the woman who had fast-roped into that valley 2 days ago was not the same woman flying out of it. The sterile white light of the Bagram Airfield Hospital wing was a harsh contrast to the green phosphor and gray dust of the Arghandab Valley. It smelled of bleach and floor wax, a scent that Elena usually found comforting, but today it felt artificial, like a mask covering the rot of war. It had been 72 hours since the extraction. Elena stood at the sink in the scrub room, letting the hot water run over her hands. She scrubbed her skin with a stiff brush, watching the soap suds swirl down the drain. Her hands were clean, surgically clean, but in her mind, she could still feel the phantom residue of gun oil and the gritty texture of the sniper rifle's stock. Lieutenant Vance? The voice came from the doorway. She turned off the tap and dried her hands with a paper towel. Standing there was a young corporal, looking nervous. Major Jenson is asking for you, ma'am. He's in recovery. Elena nodded, smoothing the front of her uniform. She walked down the hallway, the linoleum squeaking under her boots. She passed rooms filled with wounded soldiers, the low hum of medical machinery replacing the roar of the AC-130. She found Jenson sitting up in bed, his right leg elevated and encased in a heavy fixator. His chest was bandaged and his face was pale, but the fire was back in his eyes. On the tray table in front of him sat a laptop and a stack of paperwork, the dreaded after-action report. Sir, Elena said, standing at a relaxed parade rest. I heard surgery went well. They kept the leg, Jenson grunted, typing a few keys with his left hand. He stopped and looked up at her. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the hostile silence of their first meeting. It was heavy with unspoken things. I'm finishing the AAR for command, Jenson said, tapping the screen. Headquarters is reviewing the drone footage. They are impressed. They want to know about the engagement at the ruins. Specifically, the sniper fire that neutralized the PKM and the command element. Elena remained still. She knew what this meant. If her name went on that report as the shooter, her life as a medic was over. She would be pulled into the special operations pipeline, paraded as a prodigy, or scrutinized for breaking the rules of engagement regarding medical non-combatants. She would be defined by the lives she took, not the ones she saved. It was a chaotic environment, sir, Elena said carefully. Visibility was poor. The report needs a name, Elena, Jenson said softly. It was the first time he had used her first name. That shooting, that wasn't luck. That was world class. You deserve the Navy Cross for what you did. Elena looked at the empty chair beside the bed. She thought of Miller. She thought of his tired eyes and the way he had worried about Jenson. She thought of the heavy rifle that had belonged to him. Miller was the sniper, sir, Elena said, her voice firm. He was the one who positioned himself. He was the one who carried the weapon. The enemy was suppressed by sniper fire. That is all the report needs to say. Jenson studied her face for a long time. He saw the resolve there. He understood that for her, the rifle was a burden she had picked up out of necessity, not a glory she sought to keep. She didn't want the medal. She wanted her anonymity. Miller, Jenson repeated slowly. He looked back at the screen and began to type. Petty Officer Miller provided suppressing fire, neutralizing key enemy assets before succumbing to his wounds. His actions saved the team. He hit enter with a decisive click. Thank you, sir, Elena whispered. No, Jenson said, closing the laptop. He extended his hand. Thank you. I was wrong, Vance, about everything. If you ever want a spot on a team, you call me. Elena took his hand. It was a firm, soldier's handshake. I'm just a medic, Major. I belong in the infirmary. You are a hell of a lot more than just a medic, he replied. Elena gave him a small, tired smile. She released his hand, turned, and walked out of the room. She headed back to the trauma bay. A new chopper was coming in. A patrol ambushed en route Vermont. There would be shrapnel wounds, burns, broken bones. There would be blood to stop and pain to ease. She walked past a group of young SEALs gearing up in the hallway. They glanced at her, a petite woman with a stethoscope around her neck, and then looked away, dismissing her as support staff. Just a nurse. Elena didn't mind. She preferred it that way. She walked into the trauma bay, snapped on a fresh pair of latex gloves, and prepared to do her job. The hero the world needed was Miller. The hero Jenson needed was a ghost. And Elena Vance? She was exactly where she was supposed to be.